I'm not much of a hiker, but when you're in the Rocky Mountains, you gotta take in Mother Nature's majesty. I drove through a mining town outside of Denver, Colorado, up a hilly road to Serenity Peak. An old guidebook had mentioned that it was beautiful, but when I got there, I thought someone should update the entry to say it was unsettling. Part of the mountain was missing. A deep gash of scorched earth ran down it, from peak to base, like someone had tried to blast out a tunnel. I wanted to get a closer look, but there was a fence around the mountain, bearing the logo of the Landry Mining Corporation. I walked by it for a bit, then stopped when I saw the dust covering my boots. There were flecks of color in it, pink and green, blue and gold. I picked up a handful to marvel at it. I heard a wheezy laugh and looked up. An old security guard poked his head out of a booth by the gate. I worried I was trespassing, but he told me it was okay. Everyone was obsessed with that dust. I inquired, was it natural? He shook his head. No, nothing natural here. Came from the houses. They were real pretty before the incident. I had to ask, what incident? He gave me a conspiratorial grin. You didn't hear from me, but there's monsters in this mountain. You're listening to Run Fool. I'm Rodney Barnes, and this is episode 36, The Slide Rock Bolter. I sweat a lot at night, but you know what makes me feel better? Miracle Made's bed sheets. They keep me cool, they keep me comfortable, and you know what? They're inspired by NASA and use silver-infused fabrics that are temperature regulating so you can sleep at the perfect temperature all night long. This is the closest I'll ever get to space is these sheets. So go get yourself some Miracle Made sheets so you can be cool at night too, and you can feel like me. Go to trymiracle.com/run to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one or somebody that's just hot and sweaty that you want to cool off, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo RUN at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you aren't 100% satisfied, you get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/run and use the code RUN to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40% off. Again, that's trymiracle.com/run to treat yourself. Thank you, Miracle Made, for sponsoring this episode and for keeping me dry. Trish Manners stared up at Serenity Peak and blinked back tears. It wasn't nature's beauty that amazed her. It was the 20 brand new, brightly painted houses that studded the mountain's rocky base, like precious gems. The development was called Hopeful Heights. It looked pricey, but it was actually subsidized housing for poverty-stricken locals, courtesy of the Landry Mining Corporation, where Trish was head of public relations. Now, was Landry to blame for those people's misfortunes, since they devastated the local economy by buying all the mines and firing half the employees? Sure. And was this project timed to pull attention from some pesky fracking allegations? Absolutely. But Trish hadn't championed Hopeful Heights out of cynicism. Though you wouldn't guess it from her designer suit or her Mercedes, Trish grew up dirt poor. It was a rocky road from the trailer park to the C-suite, but she'd made it. She was finally helping other people do the same, and it would make one hell of a LinkedIn brag, too. She gripped a microphone and turned to a crowd of executives and reporters. She asked them to welcome Hopeful Heights' first residents, the Phillips family. A couple and their daughter walked up. They waved, looking uncomfortable but adorably humble. The girl, Marnie, was about 10. Her hair was a mess and she looked surly. She reminded Trish of her younger self. Trish asked, was Marnie excited to move into Hopeful Heights? She was hoping for a soundbite to make the press say, "Aw," but Marnie frowned. "No, I want to go home." Trish's eyes darted to the crowd where Ben Stanley smirked. He was her PR nemesis, an annoyingly handsome eco-journalist who wrote scathing op-eds about Landry mining. Trish wanted to slap his camera away, but she kept her smile on and reassured Marnie she was home. And now she'd get to do the ribbon-cutting honors. Trish gave her a pair of oversized scissors and guided her to a gold ribbon that spanned the front porch. Marnie reluctantly snipped it. Everyone clapped as the Phillips family opened the door and stepped into their beautiful new beginning. Trish basked in the applause until she realized there was a rumble growing under it. The claps died as others felt it too. Then the reporter pointed up at Serenity Peak and yelled, "Avalanche!" Trish's jaw dropped. A dust cloud cascaded down the mountain, headed for the houses. It looked less like a jumble of rocks and more like a giant writhing mass. Trish was great at getting herself out of tough jams, so she ran, speeding through the crowd, jostling past panicked executives. Not the best look for a PR person, but this was about survival. She pumped her legs, praying her stilettos wouldn't snap. She was almost at the road when Ben Stanley bolted past, holding his phone up to capture the chaos. Trish tripped and hit her head on a rock, hard. She looked up to see an avalanche destroy her proudest achievement. Trish could only watch while Hopeful Heights crumbled. It was a relief when her eyes fluttered shut. She drifted out of consciousness. The rumble filled her ears like an inhuman cry from the earth itself. Before she passed out, Trish wondered, was it a rumble or a roar? Two weeks after the avalanche, Trish parked near the ruins. There was a bandage on her head from where she'd hit it, but what hurt most was the guilt. A dozen people were injured, and the Phillips family was dead. Well, presumed dead, since they hadn't been found. Trish gripped the wheel and tried not to sob. She'd built little Marnie a home that turned out to be her grave. Nasty rumors were flying thanks to Ben Stanley's latest article, where he accused Landry Mining of skimping on construction materials and safety tests. Hopeful Heights was a symbol for toxic corporate negligence, and it was the last place Trish wanted to be. But she had to come back. She had a plan to redeem the company and herself. As night fell, Trish headed for the fence that enclosed the site. She'd requested a minimal presence, 1 or 2 guards, max. But Ben Stanley stood at the gate, phone up, recording. He told her he'd gotten an anonymous tip. Something was going down at Hopeful Heights. Trish's scowl melted into a smirk. "I know. That tip came from me." For once, Ben looked thrown. Trish explained. He was her biggest critic, so she wanted him here to document her quest to make things right. She'd hired a renowned geologist, Dr. Archibald Sullivan, who was fascinated by the disaster. Right now, his team was studying the site. She hoped he'd say the avalanche was a freak accident and not the company's fault. Ben raised an eyebrow. What if he doesn't? Trish nodded. It's a risk, but we're doing the right thing. Trusting science, holding ourselves accountable, learning to do better. Ben scoffed. Great buzzwords, but it won't bring that family back. Floodlights cast shadows as Trish and Ben walked across Hopeful Heights. Her heart sank when she saw the debris from the jewel-toned houses, like someone had crushed a giant box of crayons. Only the front wall of the Phillips house was left standing. She asked the guard, where was Dr. Sullivan's team? The guard shook his head. There was no team, just one weirdo. There was a flash of light in the Phillips doorway. It came from a headlight worn by an old man lugging a battered backpack. He shambled out to Trish, and she cringed. In the photo she saw online, Sullivan looked polished and smart. That must have been 20 years and 20 breakdowns ago, because this guy was a kook. With his shock of white hair, sun-baked skin, and wild eyes, he looked like Einstein at Burning Man. He turned off his lamp, saluted, and told her to call him Sully. Ben was still filming, so Trish politely shook Sully's hand. She asked where his team was, and he grinned. "Oh, I haven't had one of those since I lost my tenure at the university. But don't worry, hon. I'm a one-man army. After seeing the footage, I know exactly what happened. There was no avalanche. This was the work of a slide rock bolter." Trish asked, "Was that a kind of quake?" Sully's eyes grew haunted. "No, an ancient creature, hungry for flesh, eager for destruction. Massive and mean, but rarely ever seen, because it's good at pretending to be an avalanche." Trish shivered. The avalanche had looked weird, and the rumble did sound like a beastly wail. She quietly asked, "What did a bolter look like?" Sully whispered, "A giant dolphin with claws on its tail and razor-sharp fangs." Trish snapped out of her fear. This was ridiculous. She told the guard to take a lap, then barked at Ben to stop filming. He shook his head no, trying to stifle his laughter. Trish told Sully, "Come on, there weren't man-eating mega-dolphins in the Rockies." He shrugged. These peaks were once islands in a primordial sea. The tide may have washed out, but it left its horrors behind. Trish was about to lose it until her PR brain kicked in. If this was because of a beast, then Landry Mining couldn't be held responsible, right? Ben piped up to say no. It was their fault, because they invaded the creature's habitat. Sully nodded, siding with Ben. Trish stormed to the Phillips residence and pointed at it, furious. This was all done to build housing, to do good. She wouldn't apologize for helping people. They could attack her all they wanted, but she was on solid moral ground. Trish stomped on the porch for emphasis, and a crack ripped open in the earth beneath her. It rippled across the ground, and all three of them fell into the depths. Trish coughed and sputtered in the pitch-black underground. "Is everyone okay?" Sully was fine. Ben had broken his fall. As for Ben, he was pretty sure he'd broken a rib while breaking Sully's fall. But he'd live. Was Trish hurt? She said no. She'd landed on something soft and sticky. Sully's headlamp flickered on. He angled it over, and when she saw what she was lying on, she almost threw up. It was the Phillips family, or what was left of them. Mr. and Mrs. Phillips' corpses were mangled. Their clothes were gone, and hunks of flesh were ripped from their bodies. It looked like something had gnawed on them. It was ghastly, but Trish found a silver lining. There were only 2 bodies, so maybe Marnie was alive. Sully shook his head. Or maybe the bolter swallowed her whole. Thanks to Sully's lamp, their eyes adjusted. They were in a half-collapsed mining tunnel. Equipment littered the space, but it was old. No one had been down there in a century at least. The crack above them had caved in, and nobody had cell service. Sully insisted they had to follow the tunnel to find another way out. Ben peered down the tunnel. It led into an all-consuming blackness, and he balked. The guard up at Hopeful Heights would call rescue workers. They should stay put. Sully just wanted to go down the tunnel to prove his idiotic bolter theory. Both men looked at Trish like she was a referee. She was usually decisive, but all her recent choices had gotten her in trouble. She didn't know what to do, until a sound echoed from deep in the tunnel. A little girl's cry. Marnie. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Face it, folks, we got a lot going on. Our personal lives, politics, anxiety, depression, virtually everyone I know is dealing with something. I've been in therapy for 2 decades, and I believe the cornerstone of health is mental health. I think what really can help more than anything else is a little therapy. Getting into our lives for real. Not the illusion of pictures or reels or memes, but really getting to the heart of the matter of the difficulties that we all share in a very, very difficult world. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/run today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/run. The decision was easy. For the first time in her life, Trish ran toward the danger. They sped into the tunnel, Sully leading them like a deranged scout leader. Trish tried to ignore how slick the ground was, like something big had slithered through this passage. She turned when she heard Ben's ragged breath. He looked pale. And when did he get that limp? She asked if he needed a hand. Ben told her to shut up. He couldn't write a takedown article if she was rescuing kids and doting on journalists. Trish laughed. So did Ben. Then he stumbled and tripped over a lump. Trish prayed it wasn't Marnie's half-eaten corpse. When Sully shone his headlamp at it, she saw it was a pallet loaded with dynamite. Ben scrambled back, and so did Trish. Sully walked over intrigued. Then he opened his backpack and carefully loaded several sticks into it. Ben asked, was he nuts? Sully said, absolutely. But there's an old tale. In 1910, the town of Rico was terrorized by a bolter. Dang thing kept sliding down the mountain to swallow up miners and loggers. One day, a fed-up miner stuffed a dummy full of dynamite and dressed him in mining gear. Next time the bolter came sliding down to eat, kaboom. We might need some kaboom ourselves if we run into one. A frustrated Trish rubbed her temples. She felt like she was going nuts too. She wasn't sure if she wanted the monster to be real or not. She just wanted to save Marnie. Ben gripped her shoulders. Ignore him. Monsters are just things we make up to explain natural phenomena like earthquakes and avalanches. Sully strapped his bag on and glared. Or maybe we make up avalanches and quakes because we're too afraid to admit that monsters are real. As they followed Sully, Trish zoned out, picturing the headlines that might follow this wild quest. Great ones like, PR executive saves child, and awful ones like, random woman named Trish dies in cave. World shrugs. She gasped when Sully's arm shot out. He hissed, don't move. She skidded to a stop and heard pebbles scattered downward. They were on a ledge. If she'd gone a foot further, she'd have fallen into, well, who knew? Sully's headlamp was on, but it illuminated nothing. There was a dark abyss above and below them, and all Trish could hear was wind and the sound of waves. Sully reached in his bag and Ben worried he was going for the dynamite, but he dug out a flare gun. He aimed high, then shot the flare. It arced up. Red light shone out, revealing that Serenity Peak was hollow inside. All around them, caves and tunnels snaked their way to the top of the mountain. Then, the flare slowed and fell. Trish, Ben, and Sully followed it and saw a vast underground lake below them. They expected the flare to die when it hit the water, but it landed on a huge formation that jutted out of the lake and kept burning. It rolled by a bulbous boulder. When the boulder shifted and split in two, the group realized it was no rock. Staring up at them was a giant creature's angry eye. The slide rock boulder looked right up at Trish, Ben, and Sully. Trish wasn't sure it'd seen them until the waves swirled and a groan shook the cavern walls. Ben held his camera up to film. Trish looked around wildly, then screamed Marnie's name. She thought she heard her yell back from a cave high above them. Trish ripped the headlamp off a dazed Sully's head and strapped it on. She spun around and saw a tunnel entrance nearby, one that sloped upward. She told the men to follow her. They raced through a circular passage higher and higher through Serenity Peak. The walls and floors were ridged like a giant drill had gone through it 1,000 times, or a giant man-eating dolphin. Trish moved fast, surprised that Sully was keeping up, and worried that Ben wasn't. His breath got labored, and then he collapsed. Sully went to help, but Trish hesitated. She had Marnie to think about. Then again, it would look suspicious if she let her nemesis die. When Trish got to Ben, he could barely breathe. He pointed at his chest. With trembling hands, Sully ripped open his jacket and lifted his blood-stained shirt. A rib poked through Ben's skin. Trish gasped. Ben shrugged. Told you I thought I broke a rib when we fell down here, but I didn't want you to worry. Just then, Trish heard a sob. She stood and pointed her lamp down the passage. There was a figure, hunched in a recess in the wall, mewing pitifully like a scared little girl. Trish ran to the figure, calling Marnie's name. When her light hit it, she gasped. It wasn't Marnie. It was a slithering, fish-like creature with big, dead eyes. It unfurled from the wall, clinging to the rock from pincers on its tail. It opened its fanged mouth and let out an eerie human scream. Then it slid to the ground, barreling past Trish, headed for Ben, drawn to his wound. Before Sully could stop it, it latched onto his chest, gnawing at his exposed rib. Ben kicked it away, but then they heard skittering, and two more wretched creatures dropped from the ceiling. They rocketed up and down the grooves in the walls, leaving trails of slime, whirling closer to Sully and Ben. Trish yelled, "What were they?" Sully's eyes gleamed. "Baby bolters." Ben told Sully to run, but Sully shook his head. He slung his pack off and tossed it in Ben's arms. Then he reached out, doused his hand in blood from Ben's wound, and moved toward the bolters. He held his gore-slicked hand out, and the bolters went still. They looked up at Sully, sniffing the air and cocking their heads. It was almost cute. He looked at them in wonder, and then turned to Ben and Trish. "Sorry, kiddos. I had to see him up close." The bolters pounced. Even while they devoured him, Sully kept on smiling. As Trish and Ben scrambled off, his last words echoed down the passage. "I knew they were real." Trish and Ben staggered up a new, steeper passage, both drenched in Ben's blood. Trish kept telling him to ditch Sully's bag, but he insisted on carrying it. She didn't see the point. He was dying, Sully was dead, and Marnie was probably gone. Trish had set out to make people's lives better and led them to a grisly end. Ben grabbed her, and Trish thought she was about to pass out. If he did, she'd sit down, give up, and die right beside him. But instead, Ben pointed ahead. Light. Trish thought he was hallucinating. Then she squinted. At the end of the passage was a chamber, and through cracks in the wall, she saw the sunrise. With a surge of hope, Trish dragged Ben to the chamber, but just before the threshold, the ceiling burst open, and a bigger bolter shot down. If the ones that killed Sully were babies, this was an angry teenager, 3 times as big. Trish and Ben fell to the ground, too exhausted to fight. But then, something raced out of the chamber and dove on the bolter. The beast screamed. Trish and Ben saw a flash of silver, a flurry of limbs, geysers of thick black blood. The bolter went quiet, and Trish and Ben gawked at who killed it. It was Marnie. She just sliced the bolter apart with the giant scissors that Trish had given her to cut the ribbon at the Hopeful Heights ceremony. Before they could say anything, Marnie ripped a hunk of flesh from its remains and shoved it in her mouth. She chewed, ravenous, then wiped the gore from her lips. She stared at Trish and Ben, her eyes as dead as a bolter's. They ate my mom and dad, so now I eat them. 2 weeks in this hellish labyrinth had turned Marnie into a feral monster. Trish was horrified. This was her fault, but she'd make it right. She ran to Marnie, who gripped her scissors and backed into the chamber. Trish looked around and her heart ached. Dried bolter blood streaked the walls. In the corner was a pile of Marnie's parents' clothes. She'd taken them off their corpses to use as blankets. Ben limped around to check the cracks that led outside. They were too small for a human to fit, and he was at death's door, but he muttered that he'd find a way. Marnie jabbed the scissors at Trish and told her to stay away. The Landry Corporation had fired her dad from the mine, and they bought the land around it and forced them to leave their trailer park. Then they sent them to live in those tacky Crayola McMansions and buried them alive, so she'd take her chances with the bolters. They were beasts, but Trish's people were the real killers. Trish burst into tears. How can I convince you that I want to help? Marnie's bloody face cracked into a smile. You can die. Then she let out an ear-shattering scream. It echoed through the caverns and Trish felt a rumble far below. Then she heard a tidal wave and an ancient, angry wail. In minutes, the giant bolter would blast its way up through the tunnels to swallow them whole. She turned to a bloody, weak Ben who lay against the wall. She told him there was no way out, but Ben said she was wrong, as usual. He lifted Sully's bag flap and showed her the dynamite. Then he pulled out a lighter and flicked it on. Trish shook her head. Even if they blasted out of the chamber, the bolter was still headed their way. They had to stop it before it got out. Ben smiled sadly. I'll do both. Gotta give Sully the kaboom he wanted. Trish remembers Sully's story about the dummy full of dynamite who killed the bolter in 1910. She knew what Ben was about to do, and she tried to rip the lighter from his hand. He didn't have to sacrifice himself. If anyone should, it was her. Ben pushed her away. No, for my whole career I gave you grief, Trish. Now I'm giving you time. Time to do better. He dug into his pocket and tossed Trish's phone, full of footage that would prove at least some of this disaster wasn't her fault. Trish nodded, thankful. She heard a clatter and turned back to Marnie. The girl had dropped her scissors, looking less feral and more afraid. Trish wrapped her arms around her and pulled her to the ground. Marnie fought and clawed, but Trish held on tight to shield her from what came next. The bolter's screech grew deafening, and the rocks rained down around them. Trish looked to the passage outside the chamber and saw the bolter burrowing closer. His jaw hung open, and thick saliva glinted over rows and rows of fangs. She turned at Ben, who pulled himself to a stand and moved Sully's bag to his front. He glared at the oncoming bolter, trying to time it just right. Then he lit the wicks on 4 sticks of dynamite and waited. He turned to Trish and smirked, searching for a final zinger. But before he found it, the bolter crashed in and devoured him. Blood sprayed as Ben's body was torn apart. Then the bolter rammed through the cavern wall, ripping a giant hole in the side of Serenity Peak. The beast slid out and down the side of the opening. Trish heard it screech one last time before an explosion silenced it forever. Kaboom! Trish scrambled to the opening. The bolter's corpse slid down the mountain, leaving a sludge of primordial slime behind it. Its head was blown apart, a flaming mess brighter than the rising sun. Marnie pushed past Trish, eager for fresh air, but she slipped on the slime and slid down the mountain. Trish cried out and Ben's phone fell from her grip. She realized she didn't care. Instead, she jumped into the sludge and caught a crying Marnie's hand. They slowed down a bit, to a speed that was almost pleasant, and Marnie's cries turned to exhilarated laughter. Trish laughed too. Sure, she was sliding toward literal rock bottom, but that's where she'd started, years ago. She'd lift herself back up, and to honor Sully and Ben, she'd make sure Marnie soared even higher. The guard finished, telling me how he was the one on duty when this all went down. He'd called the rescue workers and helped Trish and Marnie into the ambulance. He'd even testified in the lawsuit, where the Landry Corporation gave Trish a mountain of cash in exchange for her silence. Trish invested it right back into the local community. Well, after she set some aside to take Marnie on a luxury world tour. She was doing better, but she was still Trish. After telling me that happy ending, the guard pulled a battered phone from his pocket, one he'd retrieved when nobody was looking. He told me I could see Ben's footage from the cave. for $100. I had to laugh. Greed, ego, and opportunism really do burrow through us all like hungry monsters. But I found it best not to feed those beasts. So even though I was tempted, I told him no thanks. I was going to try to do better. I shuffled off, kicking my boots through the rainbow-colored dust, all that remained of hopeful heights. Now that I knew how much it cost, it didn't seem so pretty. Run Fool is a production of Ballen Studios, Campside Media, and At Will Media. It is hosted and executive produced by me, Rodney Barnes. This episode was written by Amin Osman and produced by Abakar Adan and Lee Mengistu. Editing by Abakar Adan. Sound director, designer, and mixer is Kevin Seaman. And artwork by Jessica Clarkston-Kiner. Production support by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. Special thanks to our operations team, Doug Slaywin, Ashley Warren, Sabina Mara, and Destiny Dingle. Executive producers at Ballen Studios are MrBallen, Nick Witters, and Zach Levitt. Executive producers at Will Media are Will Malnati and Rosie Guerin. Executive producers at Campside Media are Matt Scher, Josh Dean, Vanessa Gregoriadis, and Adam Holler. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.